The United States told everyone there was nothing left to investigate in the Epstein files. And now Europe is out here arresting people, opening cases, and basically acting like they're reading a completely different set of documents. And that's not some subtle disagreement or legal nuance you need a law degree to understand, because those are two completely incompatible realities, and only one of them is going to end up looking honest when this ultimately plays out. So let's just walk through this like normal people for a second, because the timeline here is what makes this whole thing start to smell a little fishy. You see, after years of pressure, lawsuits, speculation, and a whole lot of "we'll release it soon," the Epstein-related documents finally came out. And the expectation, pretty reasonable expectation by the way, is that if there's anything meaningful in there, law enforcement is going to start pulling threads, asking questions, and maybe even knock on some very, very expensive doors. Instead, what we got from the US was basically a shrug wrapped in official language, where an FBI memo didn't just say, hey, we don't have enough to charge anyone, which would have been one thing, but went a step further and said there wasn't even enough to investigate uncharged third parties, which is a wildly strong position to take unless you are extremely confident you've already squeezed every ounce of signal out of that data. And that's the key detail that people glossed over at the time, because saying we can't prove anything is very different from saying there's nothing worth even looking into. And the US very clearly chose door number 2. Now, fast forward to right now, and suddenly Prince Andrew is being arrested in the UK in connection with allegations tied to who? Jeffrey Epstein. Now, while at the same time, you got prosecutors in France opening new investigations, Norwegian authorities bringing corruption charges against a former prime minister, Latvia launching a human trafficking probe, and British police actively searching properties linked to high-profile figures. So either Europe just collectively decided to start chasing ghosts for fun, or there was always more in those files than the US was willing to admit, and they're treating it like something worth digging into. And I'll be honest with you, one of those explanations sounds a lot more believable than the other one. Because think about the incentives here for like 2 seconds, and this stops being confusing and starts being pretty darn obvious. If you're a US agency and you come out strong and early saying something like, there's nothing here, everyone move along, walking that back later is politically embarrassing, legally messy, and opens the door to the question nobody in power ever wants to answer, which is, what did you miss and why did you miss it? So the easier move is to plant a flag early, call it closed, and hope nothing forces you to revisit it. Meanwhile, in Europe, you got prosecutors who see high-profile names, potential misconduct, and a massive global story, and their incentive is the exact opposite, because going after powerful people is how you build credibility, not lose it. So now you've got two different approaches to the same material, and they're diverging in real time. And the longer that gap exists, the harder it becomes to pretend this isn't just a difference in legal standards. And just to make things even messier, the United States can't even seem to get its own story straight internally, because you've got the Attorney General saying there are ongoing Epstein-related investigations, while other officials are out there suggesting there really isn't anything actively happening, which is the kind of contradiction that doesn't just confuse people, in fact, it makes them start assuming someone isn't being fully honest. And here's the part that should actually make you lean forward a little bit, because this is where it stops being a headline and starts becoming a pattern. You see, when one group says nothing to see here and another group starts making arrests off the same underlying material, it tells you less about the evidence and more about who's actually willing to follow where it leads, especially when following where it leads might take you into some very uncomfortable territory involving people who are, let's just say, not used to being questioned. And no, this doesn't mean every single investigation in Europe is going to turn into a conviction, because that's not how any legal system works, silly. And plenty of these cases could fall apart under scrutiny, but that's not really the interesting part of the story anyway. The interesting part is that they're happening at all, because that alone contradicts the idea that there was nothing worth pursuing in the first place. And once that contradiction exists, it doesn't just sit quietly in the corner, it keeps getting louder every time a new probe is announced or another name gets dragged into the spotlight. The US called this case closed because reopening it would be politically painful, not because there was actually nothing left to investigate. And now Europe is calling that bluff in real time. And here's why you should actually care about that, beyond just the headline drama, because this is where behavior starts to change. You see, if powerful people start to realize that whether they get investigated depends less on what they did and more on where it gets examined, then the game isn't about innocence anymore. It's about geography, timing, and who's willing to ask questions. And once that becomes the reality, well, even quietly, you don't get fewer problems, you just get better hidden ones. This story isn't wrapping up anytime soon because once one country starts pulling on threads like this, others tend to follow, especially when the spotlight is already on and nobody wants to be the one that looks like they ignored something big. So if you're expecting this to just fade out like it did the first time around, I wouldn't bet on that. Because now, there are too many people looking. I'm Hank, here to explain the chaos, not hype it. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place.